I was grabbing a drink in Palo Alto recently with a founder who's been a Silicon Valley fixture for 2 decades. For years, he was the ultimate California optimist, the kind of guy who'd argue that the high taxes were just a premium you paid to live in the center of the future. He used to talk about the Bay Area like it was a sacred ground for innovation that no other place could ever replicate. But as we sat there, his energy was different. He wasn't talking about his next Series B. He was showing me photos of a construction site in Miami. When I asked him if he was really going through with the move, he didn't give me a lecture on economics or some political manifesto. Instead, he pulled up a draft of the proposed 5% wealth tax on his phone. He pointed at the screen with a look of quiet, cold detachment. "It's not about the money," he said. "It's the realization that I'm no longer a citizen here. I'm just an asset to be harvested before the farm goes under." What was truly striking was his reaction when I mentioned the exit tax, the state's attempt to keep taxing people even after they leave. The man who had spent 20 years praising California's openness suddenly looked like a trapped animal. He let out this dry, cynical laugh and said something that really stayed with me. "They've stopped being a government and started acting like a jealous ex who wants half your future just for the memory of the past." That total collapse of loyalty from a man who literally helped build the local ecosystem to someone who now views his home state as a predatory service provider was jarring. It wasn't an emotional outburst, it was a calculated clinical severance. It made me realize that for people like him, the debate over voice is over. They aren't looking to vote or lobby anymore. They've moved straight to exit, and they're treating their departure like a high-stakes jailbreak.
And that clinical assessment, viewing the state not as a community you owe loyalty to, but as a predatory service provider or, a jealous ex, that is the seismic fundamental shift at the heart of this deep dive. We're really observing the marketization of citizenship. It's a profound change in the citizen-state relationship, and it's being driven by high net worth individuals and this kind of highly mobile talent.
Okay, so let's unpack the mechanics of this calculated severance. I think our mission for this deep dive is to really trace that journey. We can start with the theoretical concept of exit, then get into the really rigorous legal strategies needed to pull off what you're calling a jurisdictional jailbreak, and then finally explore the ultimate technological tools, the path to, digital sovereignty being used to protect assets against this kind of administrative overreach.
Right. And the defining core conflict here, it's the perceived failure of traditional democratic participation, what academics would call voice. For this specific group of people, when political lobbying or voting or public protest just doesn't work, when it fails to stop these objectionable policies like wealth taxes or exit taxes, the default response just becomes exit.
So instead of staying and fighting to fix the system, which is voice, they just decide to pull their capital, pull their talent, and take it somewhere else. They start looking for a jurisdiction that offers a better value proposition. It really turns citizenship into a consumer choice, doesn't it? Exit becomes this market-driven mechanism.
Precisely. And the power of that mechanism is the inherent threat. Jurisdictional competition becomes incredibly intense, and that mobility, it acts as a punishing force. States that pursue these, let's call them predatory fiscal policies, or are seen as failing welfare states, they're threatened, because their most valuable capital and their highest income tax bases can literally just vanish, almost overnight. They move to competitor jurisdictions, places that offer more favorable regulatory or tax environments like a Texas or Florida.
To really get our heads around the significance of this dynamic, I think we have to start with the foundational theory, the work that gives us the language for this whole conflict. We're talking about Alberto Hirschman's seminal 1970 work, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. It basically established the model for understanding how organizations respond to decline.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating about Hirschman's model is its elegant simplicity. It defines the 3 core responses a member has when they perceive an organization. And that could be a company, a church, a nation state, is showing a decline in the quality of its service or the benefits it provides. Yeah. You can choose exit, which is withdrawal, voice, which is protest or complain, or loyalty, which is commitment despite that decline.
And he draws this really sharp, almost philosophical contrast between those first 2 actions. Exit is tied directly to the pure market mechanism, right? It's the Adam Smith invisible hand idea. It's a silent action. So when a consumer buys a different brand of coffee or when a citizen emigrates, they are destroying a relationship without ever having to articulate why that product or that jurisdiction failed them.
Exactly. Voice, on the other hand, is inherently political. It requires confrontation. It's often noisy, ranging, as Hirschman put it, from faint grumbling to violent protest. The critical thing about voice is that it's uniquely informative. It tells you the reasons for the decline. It gives the organization or the state that valuable feedback, the diagnostic information it needs to potentially reform itself.
And loyalty is the glue holding it all together. It's the critical moderator in this whole equation. Strong loyalty, patriotism, deep community ties, even brand devotion. It significantly reduces the probability of an immediate exit, even when conditions are clearly getting worse and other options might look, temporarily unappealing.
Loyalty functions as a kind of firewall. It buys the organization time to mobilize and correct its course. But, and this is a big but, there's a condition. The model predicts that loyal members are only truly devoted to reform if their voice is actually heard, if it's addressed. If their complaints are just systematically ignored or suppressed, that loyalty erodes very, very quickly. And then exit becomes the inevitable and often highly destructive outcome.
Okay, so when we apply this framework to the modern relationship between, say, a mobile high net worth individual and the state, the model gets really predictive, doesn't it? If citizens have a credible exit threat, and by that we mean the financial resources to flee, the legal ability to evade taxes or move their assets, and if the state depends heavily on the loyalty of that tax base, then the state is, heavily deterred from pursuing these objectionable policies, like aggressive wealth or capital gains taxes. The threat of them leaving becomes this immense leverage.
That's absolutely key. The leverage is the threat. And we also see historical applications where rulers consciously manage dissent using this exact dynamic. Rulers often find it strategically advantageous to just encourage their critics or their political enemies to exit. They'll offer voluntary exile or political asylum. This acts as a political safety valve. It reduces the concentration of, malcontents. And by doing that, reduces the potential for organized voice or widespread protest inside the borders.
So if you're a ruler, letting the dissenters leave is this calculated move to maintain stability among the people who stay behind. It seems like a relatively neat solution for those in power. You just eliminate the trouble.
It often is. But history shows that dynamic can be unpredictable. Sometimes it can completely flip the intended effect. I think the most striking modern example is the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, back in 1989. Their ruling authorities were completely focused on suppressing voice. But the escalating outmigration, the mass exit, it didn't lead to quiet resignation among those who were left.
Right. I remember that period. People were just leaving across the borders to West Germany, weren't they?
Precisely. And initially, the regime hoped this brain drain would relieve some of the political pressure. But as the number of defectors just grew and grew, it reached a kind of critical mass where everyone knew someone who had left. And it actually galvanized those who stayed. The mass exit of their colleagues and their neighbors, far from reducing discontent, it triggered widespread voice. The remaining population saw the decay so clearly, and they began these massive organized protests, which, as we know, ultimately contributed to the regime's collapse and the fall of the Berlin Wall. So it proves that exit and voice, while they're distinct, can work in tandem. But in the current context of mobile capital, the initial tactical move is almost universally focused on exit to avoid financial harm.
And that brings us squarely to the high-stakes reality of actually executing that exit strategy in the modern era, especially when you're leaving a large, complex, high-tax jurisdiction like California. Like our founder friend said, the state acts like a jealous ex, and they don't just accept that you're gone. This is where the jurisdictional jailbreak really begins.
Indeed. The state is, it's fundamentally motivated to assume that the high net worth individual's claim of non-residency is a sham. And why? Because the most lucrative tax events, business sales, IPO windfalls, massive capital gains, they often happen immediately after the alleged move. The state's argument is that the value being taxed was accrued during the years the resident benefited from the state's infrastructure and security, and so the tax is owed.
So they're not just waving goodbye, they're actively hunting down former residents they suspect of gaming the system. Tell us about the mechanism they use for this.
That mechanism is the formidable audit machine run by the California Franchise Tax Board, the FTB. Their core mission is dedicated to challenging claims of severance. Their working assumption is deeply unfavorable to the taxpayers. Basically, no one truly wants to leave California, so any claim of non-residency is suspect and has to be rigorously investigated. And that can involve millions in disputed taxes, penalties, and interest that accrues over many, many years.
So the taxpayer is essentially in a defensive crouch from the very beginning. They're forced to prove a negative, prove they irrevocably severed their ties. What are the specific events that act as automatic red flags? What pulls someone into the FTB's crosshairs?
The triggers are surprisingly specific, and they rely heavily on readily available data, both public and private. The primary trigger is financial movement. If you file a part-year return for the year you leave, and that return shows a substantial amount of income realized after your alleged move date, let's say a massive capital gain from a stock or business sale or an IPO payout, that is virtually guaranteed to trigger an audit.
That is the quintessential Silicon Valley scenario, isn't it? They move to Nevada on January 1st and sell their shares on January 5th. That one massive income event instantly justifies a multi-year investigation for the FTB.
It absolutely does. Secondly, the FTB is highly organized when it comes to public information. Any media reports, an article announcing your IPO, a large court settlement, even a detailed interview about your new life in Texas. All of that is cataloged and acted upon. These public announcements are essentially invitations to audit. Third, just simple discrepancies on tax forms. If you receive W-2s or 1099s showing California source income, but you intentionally exclude that corresponding income on your non-resident return, Form 540-NR, that's a direct trigger.
You mentioned something about informants being a key trigger, which sounds almost, dramatic. How prevalent is that really?
It is surprisingly prevalent, and it's often the most painful trigger. The FTB has formal mechanisms for accepting tips, and the informants are often ex-spouses, former employees, or disgruntled business partners who know all the intimate details about a taxpayer's continued strong ties to California. We see documented cases where a bitter divorce or contentious business breakup directly leads to a tip-off that kicks off a residency audit costing the taxpayer millions. That personal betrayal is often what starts the financial nightmare.
Wow. Okay, so once the FTB is on the case, how do they actually determine if you're still legally a resident? Is there a simple checklist? Like, do you spend less than 183 days there?
No, absolutely not. The 183-day threshold is one of the most dangerous simplifications that high net worth individuals make. Residency is determined by the infamous facts and circumstances test. Sometimes it's called the closest connection test. This is an all-encompassing investigation where your residency is legally determined by the strength and location of your closest personal, professional, and financial ties. It's not just about the quantity of time you spend in the state.
So the key isn't just how many days you spend in California, but rather where the center of your life truly is.
Precisely. They conduct a full-spectrum lifestyle investigation. The factors they scrutinize are extensive. They look at the location of your spouse and children. Did you sell your primary California home, or is it just being held for future use? They verify details like your driver's license, vehicle registration, voter registration, but then they drill down into the very infrastructure of your life. Where are your primary bank accounts? Where is your wealth managed? Your financial advisors? And crucially, where are your personal professionals located? Your doctors, your dentists, your accountants, your attorneys?
So having a long-standing relationship with a beloved California doctor or even a specific Bay Area country club can become the one piece of evidence that costs you millions.
Absolutely. The FTB views these lasting, deep-rooted ties as evidence that your life is still fundamentally centered in California, regardless of the property you bought in Austin. They want to see that you have completely rebuilt your life's infrastructure in the new domicile.
Let's dive deeper into this notorious time trap that often catches even the most careful individuals. You mentioned that spending time traveling doesn't actually help your case. Can you explain the complex accounting the FTB uses for this?
This is a critical point, and it requires meticulous attention. People assume that if they spend less than half the year, 183 days, in California, they're legally in the clear. But the FTB doesn't just look at time spent in California. They weigh the time spent in California versus the time spent in the new home state.
Okay, let's use a hypothetical. Let's say a founder moves to Nevada, which has no state income tax. In the next year, they spend 100 days in California visiting family and wrapping up business. They spend 150 days in their new home in Nevada, and then they spend 115 days traveling for business in Europe, New York, and Asia. How does the FTB interpret that 100 days?
The traveling days, those 115 days in London or New York, they do not count in favor of your new Nevada residency claim. The FTB's argument hinges on a very high bar. The taxpayer has to be able to prove they spend more time in the new domicile in Nevada than anywhere else in the world, including California. If the auditor can successfully argue that those 115 days of travel were primarily related to ongoing California business interests, they can significantly undermine the claim that Nevada is the true center of your life.
So even though they spent 150 days in Nevada, the fact that they spent 100 days in California, which is their second highest number of days in any single place, that allows the FTB to argue that the quality of those 100 days, combined with the retained professional and financial ties, means the center of gravity is still in California. The numbers have to decisively favor the new domicile.
That's the critical distinction. It's a qualitative test, but it's backed by a meticulous quantitative effort. And to gather this data, the process is incredibly invasive. I mean, we're talking about auditors demanding bank statements, extensive credit card statements to track geographical spending patterns, utility bills to demonstrate usage in the new home, and comprehensive travel records, flight manifests, hotel receipts, rental car agreements. They're literally mapping your entire lifestyle.
That sounds less like a tax audit and more like a detailed surveillance mission into someone's private life.
It often feels that way. And to take it a step further, FTB agents have been known to show up unannounced at a claimed new residence, say that beautiful home in Nevada or Texas, to verify that it's genuinely lived in. They want to see personal items, signs of domestic life, food in the fridge, and demonstrable utility usage, proving it's not just a shell address for mailing purposes.
And the burden of proof is completely reversed, which just adds to the pressure.
Yes. The burden lies entirely on the taxpayer to prove they left. The FTB starts with an assumption of guilt. It forces the taxpayer to spend millions on legal counsel just to disprove these often aggressive and speculative arguments, like claiming that merely using a California-based law firm for ongoing work means your professional center is still in state.
And the timeline is punishing. If this drags on for 4 years, the penalties and interest alone could be devastating.
They absolutely can be. Audits often drag on for 2 to 4 years, sometimes significantly longer. And during that whole time, compound interest and penalties are accruing on the disputed tax amounts. And worse, the FTB has the power to initiate collection actions during the dispute resolution phase. They can freeze bank accounts, file public liens against property, which creates this massive financial and psychological leverage against the taxpayer, forcing settlements even if the taxpayer feels they have a strong case.
So if you're planning this jurisdictional jailbreak, what's the non-negotiable checklist for a successful defensible severance? What are the key actions that you have to take, immediately?
The strategy requires both immediacy and overwhelming documentation. First, you have to immediately get a new state driver's license and surrender your California one. Register to vote in the new state. Second, you must sever all possible professional ties. Find new medical, dental, accounting, and legal professionals in the new area. Change your bank accounts to local branches and update your cell phone plan's billing address and area code.
It's all about establishing a paper trail that proves the center of your life has physically shifted.
Precisely. And perhaps the single most important action is physical presence. You have to meticulously document every single day and physically spend more time in your new home state than anywhere else in the world. Every receipt, every calendar entry, every utility bill is ammunition in the inevitable legal battle.
What about that tactical legal maneuver you mentioned, Form 540NR? Why is filing that so important, even if you believe you are unequivocally a non-resident?
That is a crucial defensive strategy. Form 540NR is the California non-resident return. Even if you argue you have zero California income, strategically filing this return immediately after you move starts the statute of limitations running, which is generally 4 years. If you fail to file, the statute of limitations never begins. That means the FTB could retroactively audit you indefinitely. So filing the 540NR limits the scope of any potential future retroactive audit. It provides valuable protection and can potentially save millions by just capping that look-back period. It's a technical move that every high-net-worth individual exiting the state should really consider.
It's clear that the physical exit requires this invasive, protracted, multi-year legal warfare. Is that why the ultimate goal for the truly sovereign individual is an exit that transcends physical borders and legacy systems entirely? We're talking now about the move toward digital sovereignty.
That's the key transition. The friction and the vulnerability inherent in that physical exit, the FTB audit, the reliance on state-level courts, it's driving the pursuit of non-physical solutions. This concept moves into the realm of megapolitics, which is the idea that the major shifts in human society, the rise and fall of nation-states, wars, economic patterns, are all rooted in the changing logic of violence.
What exactly do you mean by the logic of violence?
It's simply the cost-benefit analysis of projecting power, and it's primarily driven by technology. Think historically, right? The invention of the stone wall made it expensive for invaders to project force. The invention of gunpowder made walls obsolete, which decentralized power. The invention of massive naval forces centralized power again in the hands of the nation-state. For centuries, securing wealth required expensive, massive armies and relying on centralized state protection because the state held a monopoly on force.
So the state was the only reliable custodian of capital because only the state could afford to defend it.
Exactly. But technology, specifically cryptography and decentralized networks, completely changes the underlying economic math of violence. The promise of cybercash, which was first articulated decades ago, was that wealth could be stored just by memorizing 24 words, a seed phrase, protected by unbreakable, pure mathematics that operates entirely outside of any state's physical borders or jurisdiction.
This is literally the reality that Bitcoin has created today. It's wealth secured by architecture, not by armies.
It's the ultimate asset protection strategy. Cybercash was described as encrypted, unique, anonymous, verifiable, and tradable at a keystroke in a multi-trillion-dollar wholesale market without borders. This asset is impervious to confiscation through inflation, administrative overreach, or localized seizure because the private key securing it can be moved globally at the speed of thought. The individual becomes sovereign over their wealth, completing the ultimate financial exit.
But the technology goes beyond just securing assets, right? It enables information sovereignty as well. When centralized states crack down on speech, the decentralized ledger becomes the ultimate resistance mechanism. The China case study concerning Peking University is maybe the best real-world example of this.
It provides perfect clarity on the utility. In 2018, a student activist named Yu Rizh sought freedom of information about a decades-old sexual assault case at Peking University. When she filed the request, the university administration responded by harassing and intimidating her. She wrote a detailed letter explaining this pressure, and the Chinese government, leveraging its sophisticated censorship apparatus, instantly scrubbed that letter from all centralized platforms: WeChat, Weibo, every mainstream search engine.
So traditional avenues of voice were just completely choked off, erased in moments. The state's monopoly on information prevailed.
That was the expectation. But then an anonymous individual took the full text of that letter and submitted it as data embedded within a transaction on the public Ethereum blockchain. This action demonstrated a form of censorship resistance that transcends nation-state control.
But if the Chinese state controls the Great Firewall, how can they not just erase the transaction?
That is the crucial technical distinction. They cannot erase the data on the network itself, because a public blockchain is not a centralized server. It's a distributed, append-only database. The information written in that transaction is instantly relayed and stored redundantly by thousands of participants' nodes all over the globe. The state can only control the centralized choke points, so they immediately censor the link to that transaction on third-party block explorers like Etherscan, labeling it as non-compliant content.
So censoring the link just adds friction. It makes the data harder to find, but it doesn't actually destroy the data itself.
Exactly. It's a fight against convenience, not against existence. Any technically sophisticated individual within China can still run a full node, even using a proxy or VPN, and view the raw transaction data directly. The cost of attacking the entire Ethereum network to alter its history and remove that transaction would be astronomically high. It would require immense financial investment, hash power, and the impossible task of persuading the global social consensus of the network to accept the change. The technical and economic hurdle renders the data effectively immutable and highly resistant to censorship.
And the use case for digital protest didn't stop there, did it? We saw a response after that.
We did. Following the Peking University letter, an anonymous response, also expressing solidarity and disappointment with the official state narrative, was embedded in a transaction from another institution, Tsinghua University. This confirmed the utility. The technology allows for uncensorable, perpetual digital protest, transparent communications that defy a nation-state's ability to retroactively erase history, all recorded forever in the blockchain's immutable ordering mechanism.
So we have two primary tools here for digital sovereignty, Bitcoin and Ethereum. Do they offer the same level of security and utility for this kind of information sovereignty?
They offer different critical trade-offs, and it really depends on what you're trying to secure. Bitcoin provides the absolute highest security guarantees and the most decentralized social consensus, which makes it the hardest ledger to attack or alter. However, its protocol limits data storage capacity, a maximum of about 40 bytes via the OP return function. This makes it suitable for notarizing the cryptographic hash of a document or embedding a highly condensed message.
To confirm that historical reference, that's how Satoshi Nakamoto embedded the Times newspaper headline about the bank bailout in the Genesis block, right? A short, impactful, permanent message.
That's the perfect historical example. Ethereum, by contrast, allows for much larger data payloads, which is why the full lengthy text of Yuxin's letter could be embedded. However, Ethereum has historically faced higher social risks to its immutability. A prime example is the VDO hack in 2016, where a central group of key figures intervened to reverse a massive loss of user funds, essentially resetting the ledger.
So that intervention, while you could argue it was morally justified to save the users, it fundamentally compromised the idea that the Ethereum blockchain was an immutable, unchangeable record, independent of human decisions.
Precisely. It created a precedent for human intervention, which compromises the cryptographic guarantee of immutability when you compare it to Bitcoin, which has never undergone such a centralized retrospective change. So, for short, critical data points where absolute security is paramount, Bitcoin is superior. For larger and more complex data storage in the context of protest, Ethereum offers the necessary utility, though with slightly weaker immutability guarantees. But both represent powerful tools for the ultimate digital exit.
We've covered the theory and the dual realities of exit, this meticulous physical jailbreak and the ultimate digital sovereignty. Now, let's circle back to the macro reality of jurisdictional competition. We established that the movement of high net worth individuals punishes high tax states, pushing people to places like Florida or Texas.
That is the intended macro effect, yes. Competition rewards the low-tax jurisdiction. But when you drill down into the reality for the average worker, the people who rely on those state structures, the competition is about much more than just the income tax rate. It involves a really complex set of trade-offs, which essentially translates into a massive shifting of regulatory and financial burdens.
This is where we need to move beyond the founder flying to Miami and look at the complexity of jurisdictional arbitrage for the middle class. Let's use the comparison between a public school teacher in Tampa, Florida, and one in New York.
The salary disparity alone is staggering, even when you account for education level. A teacher in Tampa, Florida, holding a doctorate degree, makes approximately $64,000 a year. The New York teacher, with a master's degree and 30 credits, so a slightly lower educational level, makes over $113,000. That means the Florida teacher is earning roughly 44% less income.
Now, the low-tax state advocates would immediately counter that with the cost of living, arguing that the effective standard of living balances out because New York City is so expensive.
That argument often fails the mathematical test. While calculated cost of living metrics suggest Tampa is about 32% lower than NYC, the substantial 44% salary gap is wider than the COL savings. When you run the actual numbers, the Florida teacher's overall standard of living is demonstrably worse. They have significantly less disposable income relative to their mandatory expenses and their professional efforts.
And the standard COL calculators, they miss the real-world operational costs of living in a low-tax, low-public services state.
They miss the hidden burdens. Take transportation. The New York teacher, especially in the metropolitan area, can often rely on cheap, functional, and extensive public transportation. They can avoid mandatory car ownership. That saves them thousands of dollars annually. The Florida teacher, by contrast, is often forced to incur mandatory car payments, insurance, gas, and maintenance costs, a massive, unbudgeted burden that eats up a significant chunk of their already lower income. This huge transportation discrepancy is a cost of living difference that shifts the burden entirely onto the individual.
So the state reduces your income tax, but it essentially forces you to take on a massive private debt burden to compensate for the lack of public goods.
That is precisely the mechanism of the burden shift. But we also have to consider the profound non-financial factors involved in this competition. And these relate directly back to our discussion of voice and loyalty.
You mean things like job security, professional autonomy, benefits?
Exactly. Look at union strength, which is the institutionalized mechanism for voice within a profession. Florida teacher union strength is ranked 50th, the absolute worst in the entire country. This near impotence translates directly into tangible professional loss, worse health insurance, weaker pensions, reduced benefits, and significantly less job security compared to their New York counterparts, who have robust union protection.
So the teacher in Florida essentially trades lower taxes for the loss of their collective voice and all of its associated economic protections.
It's a loss of bargaining power that directly affects lifetime economic security. And furthermore, there's the volatile political and social climate, which can act as a massive push factor for exit from or loyalty to a jurisdiction.
What are residents citing in these low-tax environments?
Well, despite the conservative labels, residents are citing concerns about what they perceive as a big brother government interfering in their professional lives. This includes anxieties related to state-mandated political interventions in the curriculum, fears of book banning, and the inability of teachers to be openly supportive of LGBT students without fear of professional repercussions or even criminal charges under certain new statutes.
So the political environment can actually feel oppressive, even under the guise of conservative freedom.
It creates a new form of regulatory burden, a social or psychological tax that offsets the financial savings. The core takeaway here is that while the jurisdictional exit mechanism is active and powerful, the competition involves shifting burdens. High-tax states often offer higher wages, robust public services, and stronger professional protections like unions, while low-tax states offer tax savings at the expense of those wages, public goods, and social freedoms.
And crucially, the system works really well for the capital class, but the regulatory competition passes that burden down to the wage-earning residents. The founder in Palo Alto can afford to pay for private security, private schools, and private health care to substitute for declining public goods while pocketing the massive tax savings.
Which is why their exit is demonstrably net positive. For the public service worker, the exit often makes them poorer, less secure, and professionally compromised. The wealthy consume jurisdiction. The middle class often suffers the trade-offs of the competition.
So what does this all mean when we bring our findings to a synthesis? We started with this jarring realization that for the most mobile and informed citizens, the debate over voice is over. It's been replaced by the immediate calculus of exit.
We confirmed that the theoretical foundation for this Action Hirschman's model is playing out in the real world. It demonstrates that the credible threat of exit is now the most powerful deterrent against predatory or failing governance. When a state acts like a jealous ex, loyalty collapses and the severance is initiated.
And the second layer was the strategic reality. The physical, geographical exit is no trivial matter. It's a meticulously documented legal jailbreak that's required to survive the intrusive scrutiny and reversed burden of proof imposed by aggressive tax auditors like the FTB. This exit has to be complete, immediate, and overwhelmingly documented to be defensible under that closest connection test.
And the third, ultimate layer is the non-physical exit. Digital sovereignty. Leveraging cutting-edge technology like cryptography and public blockchains provides the informed individual with a means to render both their wealth and their ability to communicate information resistant to the centralized confiscation or censorship attempts of the state, as we saw demonstrated by the immutable protests recorded on the Ethereum ledger.
The individual who is mobile and informed is no longer merely a passive subject of governance. They are actively consuming jurisdiction, both physically and digitally.
That is the new power dynamic that is reshaping the modern age. Loyalty is no longer an inalienable patriotic duty. It's a calculated transactional asset that can be severed and moved instantly when the value proposition of jurisdiction declines. The state that forgets it is operating in a competitive global market, risks watching its most valuable assets, both human and financial, walk out the door, physically to a new tax haven, and digitally into the immutable refuge of the blockchain.